In this episode, I am once again joined by Ron Serrano, longtime meditation practitioner, contemplative neuroscience subject, and co-founder of the online meditation group Dharmachanics. Ron gives a summary of the major studies in contemplative neuroscience in the last several years, in many of which he was a key subject. Ron explains several historical and ongoing studies, including Dr. Jud Brewer's landmark Yale University study into the default mode network, hypotheses about the posterior cingulate cortex and the sense of self, and the promise of brain scan technology and real-time neurofeedback devices to fast-track enlightenment. Ron also draws from his experience leading the online meditation group Dharmachanics to offer insight into the typical trajectory towards transformative spiritual experiences, patterns of development in meditators, and how he responds when somebody claims they're enlightened. So without further ado, Ron Serrano. Ron Serrano, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, it's a delight we're doing this again.
Well, this is a sequel long in the making. The last time we spoke was, in terms of an official interview, was 4.5 years ago in July 2020, and that in episode 57. I can't believe that. That seems such a long time ago.
Yeah, it's a long time, and you know how that works. Everything's changed and nothing has changed. But I'm sure we'll find some stuff to talk about here.
Well, that actually might be an interesting starting point. If you cast your mind back to July 2020, what has changed and what hasn't changed for yourself, for your own practice, your outlook, so to speak?
Well, like I said, in a way, nothing has changed. So you remember from last time, I talked about that sort of commitment I made to just stay on continuous retreat. And that was back just after, the new millennium, and that's continued to happen. It's the same instructions of meditation, doing that every day, making everything a Dharma activity. So that's just been sort of a way of life. You just get used to doing it. It works very well. And of course, what happens is things just get deeper and deeper, and that's the beauty of the Dharma. It's just layers and layers and layers. So it's all been really good. And of course, Dharmachanics has grown quite a bit. We talked about that in our first go-around. And that first interview was like early pandemic, right? And so the pandemic was a really big thing for any kind of online type activities. So we're probably have 3 times as many members. And it's really grown, not just only in terms of the members, but the kinds of interactions that people are having, the kind of capabilities that people are able to take advantage of. So that's all been a really nice development. And of course, the other thing is when we first did it, you and I were like new acquaintances. Now we're like old friends. So we've been doing a series of these hangouts together on your podcast, which have been really, really well received. People have gotten a lot out of them. So lots of new things in addition to the old things.
Yes, in Dharmachanics, about quarterly, you host a hangout and you choose one of the episodes and I come along and we all discuss it together. It's really one of the highlights for me to do that. So I've enjoyed it a great deal. When you say increased capacity in the Dharmachanics, do you mean to say that people have progressed in terms of their practice or their realization and things like that? I mean, 4.5 years, I guess, is a pretty good chunk of time for practice, and one might expect to make some degree of progress during that time. Have you noticed that sort of thing among your community?
Very much so. Many, many examples of people making some really big breakthroughs. And, it's there's a reason why Sangha is one of the 3 jewels. It's an important part of the equation. And in some ways, it's the toughest part of the equation. The Buddha Dharma aspect, with the internet now, there's so much stuff available. There's books, there's podcasts like this. Sangha is a bit trickier, to really find a community where you will make connections with people that will really kind of leapfrog your practice and vice versa. That's a trickier thing to do.
And my last question on this then, before we look at neuroscience, which we're hoping to do, contemplative neuroscience. Have you noticed any patterns then? Just being in this community and leading this community and seeing people progress, and have you noticed a pattern or a trajectory that people have tended to go on?
Oh, yeah, very much so. On the one hand, it's all different. Everybody has a different path. It's all unique based on our DNA and our background and our families and whatever. And yet, there's a real sense in which it's all the same. And that's why the Dharma works. That's why, the Buddha could have, or other spiritual leaders could have defined a system and communicated it, and people could have gotten the benefit from it. So you see these sort of recurring themes and patterns all the time. It's really quite remarkable. I mean, it's just it's fascinating to watch.
What are some of these recurring themes and patterns? Might you plot some of them for us?
Well, I'll just babble a little bit. I really haven't sat down to think about it, because in a way we live it all the time. We have discussions. Most people that come to the Dharma and that regularly are involved in the Dharma, they're reading books, they have their friends are Dharma friends, they're doing hangouts and things like that, all at least got some kind of a glimpse of like the real deal. Okay? And so it might have been some just as even as a child, sometimes being out in nature, and there's just this moment, just this quiet moment. Might be somebody that had took psychedelics, somebody that went through some kind of a very difficult experience of losing a loved one or something, like in the aftermath of that. And that little sort of glimmer showed them something that they have a certainty about. There's various depths to which it may have gone, but there's like a certainty. And that certainty sustains them through the Dharma, because, there's sort of ups and downs, and we all know how that goes. And the other thing is that there's a whole set of experiences that take place along the path. That's why there are these maps. Just like there's a consistency in individual practitioners, there's a consistency in the experiences that take place. And all of these experiences have an ineffability about them. Okay, you can't really describe them like any experience. Like if I ask you to tell me what it's like to taste chocolate, you really can't do it. You can say some things, but it's mostly kind of arm waving. And yet, in spite of them being ineffable, they can be pointed to, which means that if you get a bunch of Dharma friends together and you develop a common vocabulary, and that's important because a lot of times terms are thrown around in the spiritual world, emptiness, non-duality, and all this stuff, and people mean different things. So you got to really, what does that really mean? You develop common vocabulary, you you develop a certain trust and respect in one another. You can have these discussions about these ineffable experiences, and in the pointing, different people will point in different ways. Something will happen. Something will be revealed in a way that's meaningful and helps people to progress along the path.
And what are the typical experiences that people will begin to have? They've got some glimpse. They have a sort of certainty at some depth or another. They come to a place like Dharmachanics. And I suppose one of the first hurdles is to establish regular practice. And I think that sometimes is also the last hurdle, in the sense of if one doesn't cross that, it seems there's sort of no hope, and some people never do. Once regular practice has been established, then what happens?
Yeah, so the types of discussions, there are generally two buckets of discussions. One are what are called, you're familiar with the term yams. Yams are experiences, spiritual experiences that one has when one practices, when one has a consistent practice. And so the trick on these jnans, different traditions have different views about the jnans. There are certain traditions that when you have these spiritual experiences, there are certain traditions and certain teachers that will tell you, no, forget that. That's nothing. It's just an experience that comes up when you meditate. It comes and it goes. Forget about it. And there are others that will tell you like they're a big deal. And because they're taking you, not necessarily in themselves, but they're taking you in a direction that is the right direction for things that really are a big deal. And so the art here is they're actually both right. You can make too big a deal out of these things, but on the other hand, you don't want to throw them away because there's something good about it. So with a Sangha, what's good about this is you get that balance. There's the right answer is that there's a kind of balance. And so normally what happens is other people say, oh yeah, I had that experience. And they can talk about what came out of it, what the results of it were, but that you can also get like these false positives. You can think something's a big deal. So that's like one bucket of the kinds of things that happen. And then of course the other thing is our awakening experiences, particularly initial awakening. And again, it's one of these things that it's ineffable. And the other thing that's actually in a way making it more difficult is that there's so much stuff on the internet. So people are, doing interviews with people who have had an awakening experience, particularly an initial awakening experience. There are things that are being written about it, books that are being written about it, posts that are written about it on different social media sites. And the problem is that people now know like the things to say, like they know the answers, the right things to say. And you can describe something, but it doesn't necessarily mean the experience was there. And of course, the criticality is the experience. It's a seeing, it's a recognition. Initial awakening is a recognition. Something is recognized that was there all along, that was not seen. And it needs to be an understood experience. And so that's something where, your friends can sort of, can keep you honest. They can sort of push and prod, and of course you're the ultimate arbiter. You know whether the practice is working, whether your life is getting better, but it's very easy to get deluded. I mean, the whole path in essence is seeing through delusion, and the easiest person to fool is yourself. And good Dharma friends can sort of hold your feet to the fire a little bit and call you out on your behavior or something if something is sort of needs to be seen, if something needs to be revealed. So those are the kinds of discussions that often take place.
And how do you handle it in Dharmachanics if somebody comes into the group and says, I think I'm enlightened, or I think I've done it. Last Tuesday I was meditating or whatever, and I got up and suddenly, everything was different. I think I'm enlightened now. How do you handle that when someone comes in with that sort of a report?
Well, the first thing is you feel like this mudita, you're just happy that the Dharma is working. And then you start to have some discussions about it, you unpack it. And it's all about the phenomenology, sort of, what the experiences were up to, during, afterwards. And you do it in a way of trying to help the person process it. Because, one of the big things that happens after these experiences, false or true, is a review process, where you start to look at it, you start to integrate it. And so your intention is to be like a resource to help them as much as you can.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Thank you, Ron, for those reflections. And we plan to come here and talk about contemplative neuroscience. And that's something you have quite a history of involvement with. Principally, I believe, as a subject of various studies. And you're really quite connected in that world and have seen with your own eyes, and you're participated with your own neurons in many of these kind of studies and so on. So I'm curious if we might begin there, in fact, with your own history of involvement with contemplative neuroscience.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just babble a little bit, and you'll cut me off and direct me if I go on a little bit too long. I think it all started in I believe it was 2008. I got a call from Jud Brewer, who was at Yale at the time, and he said, look, we're doing this study on long-term meditators, and we'd like you to participate. And it turned out that Jud had this hypothesis that he wanted to test about an area of the brain in the default mode network called the posterior cingulate cortex, the PCC. And so when you're going to do a study like that, you start talking to people that are well-known long-term meditators, and one of those was the guy I learned the jhanas from, Lee Brasington, who's a good friend of yours and who you've done many interviews with. And Lee said to Jud, yeah, this guy, he should be part of the study. And there was a kind of a plus here, which was that Jud and I are almost neighbors. I'm only about a half an hour away from New Haven. And this turns out to be very handy, because when you do a study like this, you need a guinea pig. You need someone that you can test the protocols with. So before you line up a bunch of scanner time and a whole bunch of meditators, which he was flying in from all over North America, really all around the world, you want to make sure it works. And so the instructions need to be clear. You need to make sure the timing of it works. There's just like a lot of like nuts and bolts mechanics. So I was the guinea pig, and I wound up doing a lot of trips to New Haven, a lot of brain scans. And of course, that study, in a way, I was quite honored, because I'd only been really meditating seriously for about, I don't know, maybe 7 years. I didn't really think of myself as a long-term meditator. In the overall scheme of things, that's not a long time. There are many people that have been at it many, many decades. So I was happy to do it. And as you know, the study wound up being quite a landmark study. It was like a big deal in terms of what was found. And interestingly, there's a guy who's kind of well known, getting to be well known, named Giulio Tononi, that you may be familiar with, who has this integrated information theory. And it's this notion that consciousness is all about processing information and the ability to integrate information. And systems that can do that at a higher level, integrate more information, have a higher level of consciousness. And this has gotten a lot of play because you can apply it to people, sentient beings, and also AI. And one of his theories is that the PCC apparently is the one place in the neural infrastructure where experiences of anatta can be recognized. Okay, so that's actually kind of a big deal, because the key to the self is, it's not real, it's made up, it's a story that we make up. And as a result of it, people are in states of no self a lot. People talk about, their hobbies, and they say, well, why is that your hobby? Well, it's because I lose myself. Well, they do. They stop making the self. This happens in sports a lot too. People have these incredible performances. They're just let loose. But the thing is, they're not recognized. And that's why it's not an awakening experience. So if the PCC really does have this like really privileged position, it makes it a very important correlate for awakened states, right? Which I'm sure we're going to get into. Okay, so that's the short story on the Jud Brewer study, and as you know, it was a landmark study. We talked about it some last time. I'm going to move on from that unless there's anything you want to say further. Okay. All right. So then, Jud continued. He left New Haven. He went up to UMass up in Worcester, and then down to Brown, where he is right now. And so I would periodically be doing brain scans with him. One of the things that we were able to do is the original rig. One of the dreams, I'll say, of that PCC study was the ability to bring this to the mass market. So the notion that you wouldn't have to, get an fMRI, which costs thousands of dollars, per hour. Not many people are going to be able to do that. But these new little, portable skull caps the little portable rigs were evolving very quickly, where you could start to get not only like the time series and the EEG type, brainwave type stuff, what they've been doing for quite a while, but also like this pinpoint accuracy for areas like the PCC, which is a very small little group of voxels, like on each side of the brain. And so the idea is, wouldn't it be great if this could be brought to the mass market? Because people had some breakthroughs. And I think I mentioned this last time. This was really a breakthrough in my practice, to be able to see the PCC in real time. All learning, all human learning, I don't care what it is, has to do with feedback. So meditators, when you meditate, you're actually getting feedback. You might not think of it that way, but you're trying something, you're doing a new technique, you see what happens, and you're picking up on subtle cues of, oh, mind is becoming more calm, the mind is becoming more clear, it's easier to hold on to the meditation object, it's not being distracted, okay? And so little by little, that's why long-term meditators got a very different result in the brain scans than the newer meditators. Because you're getting, little by little, you're getting this feedback, but it's a really slow process. And in the scanner, you were getting this much more like rich real-time feedback, because you're looking at your PCC in real time, and there's like a 2 or 3 second lag, but you start to figure it out, and it feels like you're getting all this information. It's like you're getting a download from your own neural infrastructure. And so you look at what happens when the PCC is sort of flat, and then what happens when it does a dive? What's that like? What's the phenomenon? What's that feel like? What happens when there's an uptick? And it was not an overstatement to say that in like a few dozen hours of doing that, of watching the PCC, there was enough feedback, it almost felt like years of meditation. Right? So the idea of bringing this to the masses, this was like a neat thing. We were all excited about that. So one of the things I was doing is I was trying out the rigs, and we were able to get the number, I think the original rigs, there was fMRI, and then we also did the rigs. And I think there were like 128 nodes. And of course, that's not practical. At home, you're not going to get the goop and get everything lined up and make sure they're all intercommunicating with one another. It's not going to happen. So we were able to cut that significantly. It's continued to drop. Unfortunately, it's still not small enough. I think you still need like, 48, something like that, nodes to get the kind of precision. When it gets down to something like 10, then you'll be able to buy one of these things and watch your own PCC in real time. So we continued to do things together. And then 2020, which is when we had our first interview, was positioned to be like this big year in neuroscience. There were 3 studies that I had already agreed to do. One of them was a neuro-correlates of jhana. And this was something we'd been talking about for years and years, and we actually did some scans. We had a little bit of extra time. Jud and I did some scans, and there had been about, quite a few years before that, at least 5, maybe 10 years. Mike Haggerty had done like a sort of a quickie on a small budget study with Lee Brasington to do some neural correlates on the first 4 jhanas, but this was really, really preliminary stuff. So there was a study to do that. There was also a study with Judd at Brown. There was a study at New Haven. And of course, COVID killed all that. It stopped immediately. No one was doing anything, much less brain scans. And of course, when that happens, the funding disappears, because the funding sources, they all have their budgets and things they need to do. And to my knowledge, none of those 3 studies ever started back up again. Okay, so I'm going to take another pause here, or if not, I'm just going to keep rolling here.
Well, I do have a question actually about something you said.
Okay.
One sees, I think, a proliferation of home brain scan kits that promise instant or near instant neurofeedback for meditators for the low price of $350 or something like that. You can get yourself a kind of brain hat, and it gives you, you can see if you're in the gamma or the delta, and then, studies have shown, et cetera, et cetera. So, and here you're saying that this rig that you're working with, it's still not commercially viable yet. So what are these things that are out there, these brain hats that you can buy for the low price of, etc.? Are they kind of piggybacking a little bit on this science that you've been a part of? Are they a lesser beast? What's going on?
Well, let me say, first of all, I've never used any of them. Okay, and so I do know some people that say that they've gotten some really good results for them. They are feedback. My own hunch, based on what I know, okay, and this is just my opinion, is that the real payoff in this stuff is not the brainwave stuff alone, because everybody has like the full range of brainwaves, when you're asleep, when you're awake, when you're dreaming. It's the combining this with the location, right? Because at any point in time, the brain is very complex. There's a lot going on, and it really matters what parts are doing what. Are they heating up or cooling down, and are they interconnected? When you can combine that functional capability with a profile of the neuro-correlates, okay, and this is what I'm sure this is what we're headed towards. We're going to get into more of this, that indicate progress along the path. This discussion we had about nyams earlier. There's nyams and there's nyams, and you're getting closer and you're closer. And once we know the correlates of those, if you have the ability to take look at your brain in real time, or even just snapshots, to look at, are you moving in have you achieved those correlates, and are you moving in the direction of those correlates? That's real gold. If there's stuff before that in looking at brain waves, that's great, but I suspect that that's where the big payoffs are, if that makes any sense.
Yep, very interesting. Okay, thank you. Please continue the narrative.
Okay, so the next big sort of breakthrough on this topic is this Harvard study that's taking place with UMass General. You're familiar with this at all?
I've been hearing rumblings, yes.
Yeah. And I don't know. I know you've done a bunch of podcasts with Daniel Ingram. Has he talked about this at all?
He has mentioned it, I think. Yeah, but he didn't go into detail in an episode.
Okay. All right. So let me just talk a little bit about to give you and your viewers some background. Okay. So normally, the way a neuroscience project works, like any scientific study, the scientist or someone has a hypothesis about this is how something works, okay? And then what you do is you design a study that will either validate or invalidate the hypothesis, okay? And if you validate the hypothesis, you probably have a paper that comes out of it. And if not, maybe you go on to something else. You learn something from it, and you do define a second hypothesis. This is how science works, right? And what happens with the data that's collected, and it's very, very expensive to collect this kind of scanning data. Like I said, it's thousands of dollars per hour of fMRI time. After the study is done, whether it was successful or not, whether the hypothesis was validated or invalidated, the data is almost completely useless because it was just to validate that hypothesis, okay? So, Daniel and I had this sort of ongoing discussion, very good-natured sort of back and forth, actually since the Jud Brewer study, back in when that started in 2008, 2009 or whatever. We were both subjects in that brain scan study. We got to know one another, and we had a variety of things that we would debate back and forth. And sometimes we would agree on things, and sometimes we would see things a little bit differently, like all people do. And a lot of times we would say, something, there ought to be a way to find out. There ought to be, with all the advances in neuroscience, there ought to be a way that the brains could be scanned, and we could answer this question. And so Daniel finally decided that he wanted to do that, and he actually has made some financial commitments, and some other people have done this. These are expensive studies, and so it's hard to get funding for them. You can get funding for studies of illnesses, mental illnesses, or all kinds of depression and things like that, because there's NIH money. That's where most of the money comes from. But for these studies about well-being, it's very hard to come by. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be that way. We want to reduce dukkha. We want to reduce illness when people are suffering. That's a good use of money. But there actually might be some breakthrough things in these studies of higher well-being that could actually be a breakthrough for people with depression, dark night type stuff, or just in the general population. So the idea here was to do kind of like a gold standard. And when I say gold standard, it's on a couple of fronts. One of them is the phenomenology front, which is what are people really experiencing in the scanners, right? So, you and I might be scanned and you might say, oh yeah, I was in the second jhana, and I might say I was in the second jhana, but we might actually be experiencing something very different, because there are these different flavors of this. So the study uses one phenomenologist, just one. So all the input is coming from one person, a guy named Turye Sparby. He's a college professor, and he's an expert on phenomenology. And phenomenology, I like to describe it as being an expert in doing something that is impossible to do. And what I mean by that is what the discussion we had earlier about the ineffability of these kinds of experiences. All experiences are ineffable, and certainly these meditative experiences have that quality that you cannot really describe them. You can point at them and say some words. And Turye is really good at this. He has written all kinds of papers on phenomenology, and he does all the phenomenology interviews with all the participants, all the subjects. He and I have done at least 8 hours. And we did it before the scans, and we did some things after the scans. The team asked him to do some follow-up. So this is really, really good. We know what people are experiencing. When we look at what their brains were doing, we also have as good a description of what they're experiencing as you can have. Okay, so that's one sort of gold standard. The second gold standard is sort of state-of-the-art technology. So it's fMRI. And it's also, there's this new rig, like a skull cap, that is both EEG and MEG. So you're getting the electrical profile of everything that's happening, and you're getting the magnetic profile. And so when I went up there to do my scans, there were 2 days. And on the first day, it was all fMRI. We did all the scans, nothing but fMRI. And then the second day, it was all the joint EEG, MEG, all exactly the same. So there's a massive amount of data, and you've got like every window that you can possibly get, given today's technology, on what is going on in the brain in real time, in like micro little details of these little voxels in the brain, these little units of volume, tiny, tiny little spots. And then the third kind of gold standard, and this is really the interesting twist, is the idea is not to just prove a particular hypothesis. It is to get a comprehensive profile, like a complete fingerprint of someone's whole neural infrastructure. Okay? So for instance, when I was getting ready to do these scans, they said to me, hey, can you do nanocycles in an fMRI? And I think your audience probably knows that nanocycles, that's progress of insight, the 16 stages of insight, starting from initial noting type insights through dark night to equanimity, through fruition and review. And I said to him, yeah, I'm pretty sure I can do nanocycles in an fMRI, but I said, don't waste your scarce resources. This stuff is expensive. And if you want to get neuroscience, this is not my core practice. It's something I dabbled around with. I play around with because I'm kind of like a meditation geek. I like to try these things. It's interesting. I'm curious. Daniel's one of your subjects. He get other Mahasi Sayadaw types. This is the practice they do all the time. If you want to do neuro-correlates on jhana, yeah, for sure. Scan me for that. And non-doing practices like Trekcho and things like that. Yeah, I've got thousands of hours in those, but don't waste your time. And they said, yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to get those subjects. But they said, we want your brain on Nana also. And so the idea is to get this comprehensive profile. So in the course of the 2 days, there were non-meditative scans. So things like structured tasks and unstructured tasks. So one of the things was to count backwards by 5 from 10,000. And you do that for like 15 minutes, or I don't remember how long it was, but it's a long ways. I didn't get to 0, but it was a long ways. And just looking at the brain, when the brain does that, and then there was also unstructured tasks. So things like, you were told the instruction was just review the events of the last 2 days. And you do that for an extended period of time. And this is back to this discussion about the PCC, right? So it turns out that there are basically two kinds of major networks in the brain. And this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but for our purposes and the non-neuroscientists and your audience, there is the task-centric network, which is what you use when you're engaged in a task. You know, you're driving a car or you're in whatever during the day. And then there is the default mode network, which is what happens when there is no task. It's like an engine idling. What's a car behave like when the car is driving, and what's it behave like when the engine is idling? And so they're getting your like base state in these two types of activities. And then it's the meditative state. So there's jhana cycles, gnana cycles, the open awareness. And, you know, this was, I'm used to when I go for a scan, you know, you drive to New Haven, it's a 2-hour scan. There's a little prep beforehand. You do the 2 hours. There's a little debrief afterwards, and that's it. You're done for the day. Well, these 2 days, these were full days. They both started at 8:45 in the morning. That's when sort of the team shows up. And both of them went past 9 p.m. at night. And there really were no breaks. You know, there were a few restroom breaks, as you can imagine, but there was no break for lunch. There was no dinner. You know, I ate dinner both nights afterwards. And the beauty of this is that this is now an asset. So years in the future, there can be some debate in some spiritual communities or in the spiritual world about, you know, how X works. And there's all this data of all these subjects where you've got these imprints of, I mean, those are what I described are pretty much all the things that you can do with a brain. There's not much that would not fall in one of those categories. And now you have all this rich data. So that's a quick overview on the Harvard study. Should I be taking a break now, or should I just continue?
Well, what are the implications of this then? What might all this data harvesting allow us to do? And also, who's been involved in this? What's this? Can you give us an idea of the participants? Are these people we might have heard of? The who's who?
Yeah. Okay. So what happens is when you're a subject in these studies, you know a certain amount of stuff, but there's a number of other things that you're kept completely in the dark about. And you can understand why that would be. You know, so as a scientist, you don't want your subjects knowing too much. So for instance, if I tell you I'm a scientist and I tell you that I'm testing a certain thing and I think this is, you know, the neuro-correlates of the awakened state or something like that, it's possible that it could pollute the results. You know, it could change the way you meditate. You might think that's a really good hypothesis, and you might kind of lean into just a little bit, consciously or probably unconsciously. Or maybe you don't like that hypothesis, so maybe there's you're clouded in a certain way. So there's a lot you don't know. And then the other thing is, you know, the HIPAA laws are such that these are client confidential, right? So the doctor cannot say, you know, we're patients. As subjects, we're kind of like patients. And so I can tell you that Daniel is involved, and he was the first one scanned. He's the guinea pig. He was to this study what I was to the New Haven study. So he did an enormous amount of scanning. I do know that I was the third person scanned, and I'm pretty sure the second person is someone that you know very well, but I don't think that this person has said it publicly, so I will not say anything about it. And that was 2 years ago, and I know there's a lot of people since then. I have put them in touch with people that I know because, you know, meditators know other meditators. So I know that N is now more than 3. I think it's probably quite a bit more than 3, and I think it's quite an amazing data set.
The implications of which are, what's significant about this, in other words?
Well, the key to this, again, to the discussion we had earlier, is these neural correlates of these various meditative and awakened states. And of course, this means that we should be able to develop the neural correlates of the jhanas finally. And there actually has been a paper that came out from the project And the only issue about it, it was only the first 4 jhanas, nothing formless, and it was an N of 1. There was only one meditator. And of course, that is not going to pass muster. The jhanas it's a controversial enough, and our brains are different enough. We are all individuals. That's not really going to pass muster. But there should be, I would assume that by now there's dozens of meditators that have been in jhanic states. We ought to be able to do finally the neural correlates of the jhanic states. The paper that did come out was extremely interesting. I think it definitely broke some new ground beyond the Michael Haggerty study that I mentioned earlier, but it's still very preliminary. We should be able to do the same thing with Nana. And of course, the big thing, the holy grail of all this work is the neural correlates of the awakened state. I mean, it's kind of amazing that no one can tell you the neural correlates of the awakened state. And we've been at this now in a way for 30 years. I mean, it was 1992 when the Dalai Lama pretty much blessed this kind of study and said that, neuroscience, this is a legitimate way to be looking at spiritual development. He formed the partnership with Richie Davidson, who's a, first-rate neuroscientist. And I had kind of naively expected that all this stuff would have come out by now. They've done studies on Tukdam. There's been a bunch of studies that have come out. But I'm now becoming more and more convinced that it is not going to happen, that is not going to be an avenue for this to happen for a variety of reasons. And so we've got to find some other ways to do it. And the Harvard study could be that way.
And why do you say this avenue is not fruitful?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, it's been 30 years. And, Richie Davidson has got to be sitting on some prime data. And the beautiful thing, of course, about it is the time series. The real gold standard would be to get a new meditator, and from the time that they start to the time that they achieve full enlightenment, and have the time series. And one of his primary subjects has been Mingyur Rinpoche. And so when they started this, back in the early 90s, Mingyur was a teenager. And he's 50 now, or almost 50. And he wrote that remarkable book, I don't know, was it 5 years ago, or maybe more than that now, In Love with the World, where he describes an experience that he had. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he had a near-death experience, and it's an awful lot like, you will hear resonances of the night that the Buddha spent under the Bodhi tree. I mean, there was some serious awakening going on here. So, just imagine looking at the brain scans of a 19-year-old versus just prior to this night, and then the scans afterwards, and now 5 years later. There's a wealth of data there, but it has not happened, and it probably, the longer it goes on, it's just likely it's not going to happen. There's a bunch of reasons why it probably won't happen, but it's really not our concern. So does that answer your question, Steve?
In a way, I suppose, yeah. I suppose this sort of data is quite precious, is it? Quite proprietary in a way, and people are sitting on it Well,
I think it's even simpler than that, okay? So the Dalai Lama has this incredible brand. And that's an asset. And so one of the questions is how would you use that brand? So when the Dalai Lama said, kind of blessed neuroscience, this was this kind of like this beautiful opening up, right? That's a massive use of the brand. And it probably encouraged a lot of other people to set up labs, do this stuff, and they can say, oh, this is consistent with Buddhism, because a lot of people would have said, oh, you're doing these scans. There's still a lot of people that are very, very skeptical about neuroscience, and I kind of get it. It's complicated. It's got like an element of like materialism to it, because the brain is material. Well, yeah, it's material, but if it's helping you get insights and seeing things about the spiritual path, that's good. But until it's really been proven. So the fact that the Dalai Lama did that, he sort of blessed it. All the people that are working on this, they can say, oh, this has got the Dalai Lama's approval, okay? as soon as, though, a report comes out from Richie Davidson, who's been working with the Dalai Lama, that these are the neuro-correlates of whatever, that's not a this. This is like a constriction around something. This is taking a view, okay? And it's guaranteed that view will be controversial. Guaranteed. There'll either be controversy around how it was done or what the result is. It's just the nature of these things. They're so complicated. And so, should the Dalai Lama spend, he's got a finite amount of time in this human body, right? It's just, that's the reality of impermanence. Do you want to spend that doing more of this kind of stuff around other themes like compassion or whatever? Or do you want to get embroiled in something like this? And it's probably not the best use of that tremendous position that he has. Now, the irony is, after he passes, these studies, if there's something is published, it won't quite have the same impact, right? Because it will not have his blessing. I mean, maybe there's a way you could give your blessing before passing away. I don't know. But you can see why there would be complexities around this.
Yes, indeed. And why is it, do you think, that the Dalai Lama is so, I don't know if I should say, not core exactly, influential, perhaps not, or what is this preoccupation with his blessing in these neuroscientific studies?
Well, this is just human nature, okay? And the way this works is this can never be an announcement by a neuroscientist. I don't care how good a neuroscientist you are. It all comes down to who the subjects were and what the circumstances were. So if you can say, hey, I came up with a bunch of neural correlates, people would say, well, those people you scanned, who told you they were awakened? Did you determine they were awakened? If the Dalai Lama blesses that, well, that's powerful, right? But a neuroscience can't do that. The neuroscience can say it was done to gold standard neuroscience standards, right? And this, why you and I talked a little bit before this about the Daniel Brown work, and this was actually quite interesting. But again, now he's someone that's passed, but he had a very interesting hypothesis. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to go any further. But you need this combination of the neuroscientist and someone with spiritual gravitas, something that people will respect, that they were scanning the right subjects in the right circumstances. Without that, it's nothing.
Right. And presumably, if these studies do succeed, then that, if you'll excuse the pun, liberates the means of determining who's enlightened from the religious institutions and leaders such as the Dalai Lama, whoever else might be construed as authoritative. And one can just put on the brain cap and let's see how enlightened you really are. Presumably that could happen.
Yeah, and I don't want to be in the position here of criticizing certainly the Dalai Lama or any of the people involved in this, because there are reasons for it, and I think realistically what will happen is neither of those views will ultimately be right. It's sort of the combination of those two together, the teacher and the tool, because in a way we each have responsibility for our own spiritual path, right? You got to do it yourself. But there's all kinds of opportunities for delusion along the way, like we said earlier. The easiest person to delude is yourself. So what a really serious practitioner would want to do is want to get sort of both validations. Both get what you can get from the neuroscience, but you can fool yourself. This stuff is complicated enough. You could cook the results. I mean, there's so many little things that one could do, and the same thing with you want to get input from a teacher, and getting sort of validation from both the technology and the teacher. That's something that you could build some confidence around. If you're missing one or both of those, it's not quite the same.
Now I'm thinking of AI, of course. that perhaps we can have a kind of AI, I don't know, later down the line can tell you if you're enlightened or not, and also get you there with real-time neurofeedback.
Well, and the other thing is, any teacher will tell you that they have like a whole like routine, a whole script when someone comes to them and says that they've had an awakening experience. And there are a bunch of ways that you can sort of get, and a lot of it is, you could like articulate it, but it's much more of like an intuitive thing. You sort of feel it, you sort of feel the other person. You could never really describe to someone how you do it, but most teachers will tell you that they've developed that, but there's false positives. And so you want to get as many feedback systems as you can. So the combination of the teacher and the neuroscience would be the ideal situation.
I wonder, if anything comes to mind, if there have been similar areas in which progress in something like neuroscience has or science in general has demystified something that was previously held in a more religious frame of some type. I'm trying to think if such a thing, maybe certain breakthroughs in psychology and so on. I'm trying to look for an analog case that we might be able to predict sociologically what would happen if neuroscience was to crack the Enlightenment code. I mean, it would presumably render quite a lot of the religious traditions obsolete from that point of view. But then one might argue that the degree to which even an Enlightenment-oriented tradition like Buddhism is actually about getting enlightened, it's not exact. It's only a part of what it does on a day-to-day basis, and perhaps it wouldn't change much at all. What would you predict sociologically might, or maybe you don't have any predictions, but what would you predict sociologically if neuroscience was to crack the Enlightenment code?
Well, it's a great question. And the first thing that came to mind is that, we've always had cave yogis, people that didn't have a teacher and they just went off in a cave. And you can imagine some cave yogis just going off with a portable rig and just doing the cave yogi thing, but with this new tool. I can't think of any analogs to it. This is some different territory, and I doubt that it will ever get that way. It's just too complicated. But you never know. It might be that when we get the neuro-correlates to the awakened state, they might be really simple. It's possible.
Or simple enough for waypoints, simple enough for a GPS sort of device that gets you in the right general direction. Yeah. And what do you think would be the implication? Maybe you don't spend any time thinking about this. What do you think would be the implication for religious traditions? Some of the people you've mentioned already, some of the meditators, have come into conflict with religious traditions, religious institutions, representatives of those religious traditions, and also with certain areas of academia where those two overlap, the humanities in particular. So I could guess, based on that it wouldn't go down well with some, and perhaps others would embrace it. What do you think would occur?
Well, this is the history of spirituality. I mean, this is what the Buddha did. The Buddha was a disruptor, right? I mean, the Brahmins did not like the Buddha because they had their sort of take on things, and he had something very different. And so the history, particularly of Buddhism, is this history of disruption where new stuff comes along, new cultures, new practices. And for what it's worth, I think it actually would be good, because this causes these discussions, these debates about the value of the institutions versus the value of the technology. And there's sort of a rationalization process that takes place, that people try different things, and people ultimately vote with their feet, right? And so traditions tend to move in that direction. I think those kinds of disruptions can be very, very productive.
Indeed. An analogy does come to mind, actually. Astronomy, something like the Copernican revolution, that sort of thing, seems to me, I would need to ponder it a bit more, but it seems to me a sort of an area that had previously, an area where some sort of knowledge base was wrested from a religious holding into a new scientific one, and then how the religious institutions recomposed around that, some in opposition, some integrating. I've interviewed Catholic astronomer, Catholic astronomer, before on the podcast, and he finds Catholicism to be his view of Catholicism, his religious view of Catholicism, to be quite consonant with his scientific practice as an astronomer. So perhaps something like that, there would inevitably be some sort of recomposition.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I think something like that would be probably a decent template for the kinds of things that might happen. But that tradition's still around, though.
Indeed, but I would say that its astronomy is not necessarily its sort of core, its raison d'etre, and not to mention the religious traditions that don't agree with this idea of awakening and instead have a deistic outlook or something like that. It would probably be quite inconsequential to them in a sense.
Yeah, interesting. It's an interesting question.
Yeah. Anyway, we're getting into this sort of tech bro speculation that is only possible because of my complete lack of knowledge about the subject. Okay, would you mind continuing the narrative? I know you had a few more things.
Yeah. Well, so I think I covered sort of the three gold standards. If you really want to do it right, you get the really good technology, you get good phenomenology to pair with the data. And then you get this comprehensive data. So the good news is that a lot of data has been collected from what I know about the study, and I don't know everything about it. I know the neuroscientists involved, Matthew Sackett and his team. Now the only bad news is these studies are really expensive, and so there's two aspects to it. One is the collecting the data, which has been done, and there's obviously more that you can do, but a lot's been collected from what I understand. And the other is processing the data. And it turns out that is really expensive. There's massive, terabytes of data or whatever, and it's complicated. And so one interesting, since we are doing the bro speculation, as you mentioned, I'm going to mention something that's very speculative, and so nothing may come of this, but I'm just going to share it for what it's worth, because having people be aware of it actually might be a good thing. And that is, potentially, all that data that has been collected could be put on an open platform. And anybody could do the analysis. So instead of trying to go out and get funding and get people to raise money who are going to do this study, and someone says, no, I want to do that study, and another one says, I'll fund something, but I want to do that. It's complex. You just make the data available. And so somebody might, as a result of that, say, hey, I have a grant. Might be something small, might be like $10,000 or $20,000, but I'd like to know the neural correlates of the fifth jhana, because that's really never been looked at before. Or look at some state across a certain kind of subjects or whatever. And you might suddenly get like this flooding of funding. And the people who might get the grants, they might be the traditional shops. It might be like Judd's shop, it might be Matthew's shop at Harvard, but it might be like, a couple of kids, data processing geeks in a garage using AI. And this would be using like the sort of the human creativity, just like letting human creativity flourish to test this stuff and make it happen very quickly.
That's very interesting indeed. And what do you think of the criticism that I've heard around, leveled at, for example, the work that Shinzen and Jay Sanguinetti are doing with transcranial ultrasound stimulation to try to get people towards enlightenment and that sort of thing? That if one has a map to nirvana, then presumably one has a map to hell as well by reversing that trajectory. Is that the sort of thing that ever comes up in ethics discussions with the scientists or the people who are around these studies? Is that something that is ever brought up? What if this understanding of the brain can be used weaponized in some sort of a way for torture, for example?
It happens. Well, there's a variation of that discussion that does take place, mostly actually, interestingly, among subjects. And I don't know if this has come up in any of your discussions with Lee, but Lee and Judd and I don't have anything against people using these technologies. If people get benefit, pragmatism. If something works for you, there's something to be said for it. None of us would use these technologies. And the reason why, these are technologies that are changing your brain. Okay? So you scan my brain all you want. You can look at it all you want. That's fair game. My brain is an open window. But once you are doing things that are like rewiring, that's something that I want to take responsibility for. That's why I have a practice. So I'm doing that rewiring on my own. It's a little bit like the psychedelics discussion, right? So a lot of people swear they had great experiences. They took something that caused them to have an experience, changed the way their brain functioned, whether it was long-term or not, we don't really know. Maybe in some ways, maybe in some other ways, we don't really know. And so that's the trick here. And I know where Shinzen comes from on this. I mean, Shinzen's intentions are only the best. And he's looking for something quick that will help people, that will reduce suffering, that will take them in the direction and give them experiences that show them that the Dharma really works and improves the quality of your life. So I'm not, giving any kind of criticism to that, but these are different approaches.
One seeks perhaps to zap the brain into enlightenment. The other, I suppose, in its application would be providing feedback for one's practice in real time, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and also you're not dependent. From what I've heard, people have some lasting effects, but you don't want to ever get in a situation where you're dependent on a particular rig or a particular drug or something. You have these very pleasant states. This is the whole idea of the path, is your well-being isn't dependent on anything. It's completely independent of circumstances. That's the path.
I could imagine my meditation practice being quite changed by some sort of device I could attach to my mind, my head. Not necessarily that it would zap me, but I could see what was going on, and I've got, your profile up there, and I'm trying to, incline myself towards the sort of Ron Serrano, Jhana algorithm or something like that. I'm imagining this sort of great distant future sort of thing. I would never want to take that thing off. I couldn't imagine going back to meditating just without feedback, with nothing, without that tremendous advantage. Surely it would be like Google or ChatGPT. Once you've tried it, it's very difficult to go back to that old paper dictionary.
Yeah, I think the idea that as a meditator, you want to get as much feedback as you can, that makes perfect sense. If you want to learn anything, that's the way to do it. Keep trying things, and the feedback tells you, yes, this is working, or no, that's not working, try something different. So if this is one of those tools, that's great. I doubt you would get addicted to it. I mean, even with the great experiences that I had with the rig with Jud, I mostly learned some things that in a way it's like my own internal feedback systems got like more discernment, and I didn't feel in any way addicted to it. I felt I got a benefit from it. I don't know that I would have gotten much more benefit from it. It's almost like I had learned what I could learn. Now, that's very simple. That's just looking at one part of your brain. If it turns out that there's a whole bunch of other things going on, it could be more involved, but I'm not too worried about people getting addicted to these things. Sometimes you'll hear that about people get addicted to the jhanas. And I suppose someone could say that about me, since I've done them every day now for well over 20 years. But it's not that way, because what happens is you do it not for the pleasant experiences, no matter how pleasant they are. You get it for the insights. You realize that's where the payoffs are. And the insights are what you take with you off the cushion. That's your ongoing life. So I think that the particular danger that you're talking about is probably in practice would wind up being fairly limited.
Sort of self-correcting then, in that sense.
Yeah, that's the beauty of the Dharma. If you're really doing it, it's about seeing things as they really are, right view, and that has a very much of a self-correcting aspect to it, as you say.
Well, thank you, Ron. This has been very fascinating indeed, and thank you for such an exciting account, really, of all the various neuroscience that you've been involved in, contemplative neuroscience as a subject. Really incredible. And thank you also for entertaining my muggle bro questions on these sorts of things. But what about AI? I'm aware how, cliche it is, but nonetheless, you've handled it very, very graciously. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we bring this to an end?
Well, yeah, Steve, the thing I have to say is thank you to you, and thank you for doing this podcast. The breadth of what you've done here, and you do this neuroscience end, you do like the far esoteric end. It's been like this tremendous portal to the Dharma, and not just Buddhists. You have non-Buddhist folks here also. And there's a kind of like a fearlessness that you bring to this. I mean, there's nothing that you're afraid to talk about. And it comes from, this genuine curiosity to just really find out the way things are. And the other thing that I'll mention to your viewers, they probably don't know it, is what a great connector you are. I mean, the number of people that you have introduced me to. And there's like a ripple effect, like a second order effect. Like in most cases, I've introduced them to someone else, and they've introduced me to someone else. So we'll never know kind of the full benefits of this. So a deep bows of gratitude to you, Steve, for everything you're doing. Please continue.
Thank you, Ron. That's very kind of you indeed. Ron Serrano, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.